Today, I'm going to be talking about Dark Squares by Danny Rensch of chess.com. A very engaging and well-written book. I'm sure the editors had something to do with that, but it's definitely Danny's story. Now, this is going to be less of a book review and more of a personal reflection because this book to me read like the family notes of a second cousin. There was so much in this book that touched me, just in terms of my own personal experience. So I've known Daddy, I guess, now over 30 years. But I was never especially close, but there's so much in this book where our lives were tangential. Okay, so the first thing we should put out there is that nobody in Danny's orbit, as far as I knew anything about the cult. Maybe just like a passing sniff of it, but nobody really knew. And I think the easiest way to understand that is if you went out and said, hey, I belong to this group where this chick named Trina, perfect prole name Trina, right? She, goes into a trance and she takes on the persona of this dude, Dr. Duran. And Dr. Duran last lived as a 16th century Englishman, and he tells us stuff. Nobody would be able to not laugh at that kind of statement, right? And so the only way that you could possibly explain that is for it to have hundreds and hundreds of pages, and then Danny at the end of the book acknowledging Dr. Duran in the acknowledgments, dude, and then saying something still like, even though I'm out of this cult, this guy I still recognize as one of my spiritual guides, teachers, right? So it took this book, I think, you can't just explain that in a paragraph. You have to do something longer with it. Okay, so the first thing I want to start off with is, maybe this is still the case today, but back in the day, in order for, let's say, scholastic chess to work well, you needed some kind of patron. Somebody who was going to go out of their way and help push you. And it's not just teaching. You need somebody to take you to the tournaments, find money for the airline, blah, blah, blah. It's a lot of work. And in hindsight, it's really interesting that there was all these quirky dudes who weren't chess dads or moms, mostly as men, weren't chess dads themselves, but were like involving themselves in this chess project really intensely. In my case, it was a dude named Andy Novak. I don't think there was anything nefarious about this guy at all. I think he was very well-meaning, but definitely quirky, the kind of dude, like if you were a parent, you'd be like, I don't know. I don't know. Now, Andy Novak, in my case, really didn't help like extravagantly by any means. But Danny has this guy in the collective, in the cult, named Stephen Camp. Now, Stephen Camp is the right-hand man to this chick Trina. He's basically doing a lot of the organizing of the collective. He's got money from the collective. So in a way, it's an interesting dream because this guy is going to say, Danny, you've got to find your purpose in chess and we're going to make you world champion, bro. And then you're going to go tell the world about the collective. You're going to be our mouthpiece. And then this like messianic thing falls upon Danny's shoulders as a kid, dude. Now, the interesting thing about that is when you think about it from a chess player's perspective, it's a golden opportunity because most kids, especially at the time, no internet. Like, how are you going to get out and actually play games against a bunch of people, right? How are you going to get coaching? You need somebody like Stephen Camp. Now, in Danny's case, sometimes Danny's going to have to rub the lotion into the feet of this dude, Stephen Camp. It's obviously a little weird and quirky, dude. It's obviously a little weird. But it poses an interesting question. Would I have done it? Now, I grew up in an intensely homophobic culture, especially with my peer group, so it would have been really hard. But on an abstract level, would I have done that and more for chess? That's a good question. What would you give to chess in order to make it happen? And so it's an interesting thought I have in this book. Okay, and so Stephen Camp is his patron here and is driving him around to all these tournaments. Now, the other thing about this that really struck close to home is even though Danny's 13 years younger than me, this whole thing going on in the Southwest, he's in outside of Phoenix, I was in Santa Fe, you got all these refugees from California from the East Coast, and they're coming to find themselves. Most of them have kids. They're all getting divorced, and they're all either in a cult or cult adjacent, right? And so my parents themselves were not in a cult, but the people all around, dude, oh man, cultish. And so to this day, if you start talking to me about astrology or crystals or something, I get a little allergic reaction. You know, I can't do it, dude. It's too much. I can't handle it. So we're both growing up in this world, even though I'm not in a cult. And then just to get a little flavor on it, which is so really a detail that was so astonishing to me, I was lucky back then to have some masters to play against. If they hadn't been there, there was no internet. Who would I have played against? So I played thousands of blitz games, real games, against two people in particular, Spencer Lauer and Steve Stubenrauch. And these dudes were definitely cult adjacent. Stubenrauch came to Santa Fe for an herbology acupuncture school. He was there forever doing that with his wife and kids. He gets divorced and then moves to Phoenix. And then who ends up playing loads of games with him? Danny Rensch, same dude. Spencer Lauer. That guy, I'm not even sure he was a weird and quirky dude in Santa Fe. Then he ends up going full right wing or something, moves to Phoenix, Whole thing ends up playing loads of games with Danny Rensch. So those were the kinds of characters back in the day that if you wanted to get good, you would have to have a Stephen Camp in your life, and you would have to have dudes like Stubenrauch and Lauer to play against. That's just the way it was. And Danny has a great description of this place, the Chess Emporium, where these characters are running around. That was the way it was. That's the way it was back in the day. Those are the people you were going to play. Okay. The other thing I want to say about being cult adjacent that I found so interesting about the story is, Danny ends up meeting the ChessCon people. I was at that meeting in 2008. It was after a tournament. It's this dinner, and they're seeking out people who are high rated to help them bring in the higher rated players to chess.com. And in hindsight, what's really peculiar, no one knew at the time that Danny belonged to a cult. Danny didn't even leave the cult till 2020. So no one knew. But the Mormons, dude, there's some really interesting similarities with Danny's cult. Because even though now the Mormons are so established and big that it's hard to call them a cult, they definitely began as a cult. And they began in a similar way where they kind of think of themselves as Christian, like this Trina chick did, right? And they have a person with visions, and that person with visions says things like, well, I need 12 wives. That's what the visions say, So once you got a dude saying he needs 12 wives with a vision, you're dealing with a cult. And so one of the amazing things about Danny's cult is, I was reading, I was like, oh, if these people hadn't been drinking, like the Mormons weren't allowed to drink. If they had not been allowed to drink, that cult might have made it, dude. A lot of the dysfunctionality in this cult is about the drinking to excess that's going on that Danny then becomes a part of. Now, the other thing that's really fascinating to me about thinking about cults is, as a parent, I now have a certain amount of sympathy with it. And what I mean by that is, when you throw your kids out into the world now, they get instantly exposed to screens through their friends and peers, even at school. At school, you got a screen just given to you, one of the first things they give you when you get there. And you get given nasty food, right? And once the kids eat the nasty food, it's really hard to have them eat real food. Very difficult. And you could say as a parent, oh, I'm not going to let my kids have it. Good luck, buddy. Good luck. But if you belong to a cult, you might have a chance. You might have a chance. I encourage you to look up Google images of this place, Tonto Village. A beautiful place to grow up, similar to Santa Fe, but smaller in terms of natural beauty, and just an amazing place to, run around in nature. Okay. Now, here's where it really was fascinating to me as a thought experiment of comparing my life to Danny's. Because I first met Igor Ivanov in the New Mexico State Championship last round. I played him 1989. And from that moment on, that guy was an amazing, interesting figure for me to think about. This huge dude, obviously a drunk, like reading all the time in his spare time. And I didn't even realize till later. It was a big disappointment for me that he wasn't reading real books. He was reading trash. But anyways, loomed large, so large, I'd see him again and again through the years, that I ended up writing a book, Lisa, which was partly just driven. Like I felt a need to tell this story. In my story, I imagined what would have happened if Igor had stopped drinking. What would have happened in that case, and what would have been like to have him as a teacher. Well, in Danny's case, dude, Stephen Camp is like, hey, Igor, I'll give you a double wide trailer. I don't know if it's double wide, but it's a trailer. I'll give you a trailer and vodka if you come teach our team, dude. And it's like, oh, Danny, I didn't realize this, dude. I didn't realize this at all. Now, the first time I actually met Danny, I'm going to say it was like 1996 or something. And they had this crew of kids that came to a tournament in Albuquerque, and Igor was with them. And I didn't really put it together as like a cult or anything like that. I assumed Stephen Camp was there chaperoning them, and I assume they all just came in a big van. And we might be state next to state, but that's a long drive, my friend. That's a long drive. So there was, for years, Igor's then teaching Danny, not in any kind of structured way, but hanging out with him and doing the old Russian technique where, you beat him from one side of the board, the kid complains, and then you switch the sides of the board, and then you beat him again. So just over and over and over. And maybe it was a weird training technique. Maybe it could have been better, but nevertheless, there you are working with Igor Ivanov for years. Kind of amazing. Kind of like my dream, but like, what would you give for chess? I don't know. I would give a lot to have Igor as my coach. I'd give him vodka. Sure, dude. If that's what the guy needed, dude, that's what I'd give him. So that is just an amazing part of the story to me. Igor has touched so many different lives. He later goes up to Utah in the final years of his life. There's kids up in there who were touched by Igor as well, working with all these people, sleeping on different people's couches. Right, very interesting figure for me to think about, and especially the thought experiment, what would have been like if I had had him as a coach, someone to guide me in chess, which I didn't, right? Okay, so an amazing read, and the final thing I just want to close out with is something I wish Danny had talked more about in the book, is the way he writes the story. It's kind of like there were other kids around, but he is the center of attention, from Stephen Camp and others. And I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that's true to a certain extent. But there were definitely other very talented kids. And I remember playing in Reno. It was either 2002, 2003. This kid named Pieta Garrett, who was part of the cult. I didn't know. I just knew he was like friends with Danny from down in Arizona. And it was a very strong kid, like 2,300. I thought he had a lot of promise. And then suddenly the kid just disappeared from chess, So I guess I wanted to know more about what happened to that crew of kids, who were part of this whole domination of the scholastic scene for a number of years in the 90s, and I guess maybe even early 2000s. Okay, so there it is. Dark Squares. We are going to try to have him on the pod to talk about it, but I decided I just wanted to share some of my personal tangents that go so close to Danny's that I hadn't realized before. So as I said, it was for me like reading a memoir of a second cousin. Bye.